Picture this, a $400,000 masterpiece of automotive engineering, meticulously crafted by the finest engineers in the business. You'd think it's already as close to perfection as it gets, right? Wrong. Enter the automotive aftermarket exhaust and power adders brigade, ready to tear apart those finely tuned machines and slap on whatever shiny bits they can find to make a quick buck. They'll dazzle you with their fancy marketing terms, boasting about their innovative designs and top-notch materials, elements that'll make you think they've cracked the code of automotive perfection. But behind the scenes, it's chaos. They'll rip out a factory system without a second thought, cramming in whatever fits and selling it to you at a premium. Sure, the fit and construction is top. They'll increase the diameter, buff up some parts, throw in a ceramic coat, give it a fancy name, but don't be fooled. They make power and sound incredible, but when it comes down to it, it's all just haphazard patchwork, fitting whatever, where it can, what it can, guided by what will sell for the most you'll pay. And who am I to say this? Well, I'm one of them. I've seen firsthand, deep in the trenches of exhaust design. While these aftermarket manufacturers are busy churning out luxury tax commodities, I'm here to tell you, there's a better way. Principles and a plan. A couple of weeks ago, we set out a plan to design and build a Lamborghini Aventador exhaust concept that had never been done before. And in today's video, we're going into detail what goes into making this concept a reality, unveiling the design, construction, and craftsmanship. We have affectionately named this exhaust the McFU, and in a few minutes, you'll see why. This is the culmination of months of thought and planning when someone asked me the question what I would do if I was going to do an Aventador exhaust. Now, in order to really get you into it, we got to start at the beginning, which is an OEM exhaust. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I really hate when people, YouTubers, lay out a plan, lay out a big, grandiose plan, and talk about the stuff they're going to do, only to find out when they get into the build, when they start tearing stuff apart, it was never really possible. Maybe it's my ego, maybe it's my pride. I like to hold my cards to the chest, and although I had a lot of ideas on what I wanted to do with this car, and a lot of ideas from the systems that we've had apart before, until those ideas are laid out in that space and I can visualize, I'm not really gonna talk about it. But there was a lot going on in my head with the OEM exhaust, which I have to start with here. Now, on the Aventador, we have 12 cylinders, composed of 4 3-cylinder banks or manifolds that house 3 cylinders each to take exhaust gases out of the system. Numbered here, 1 through 6, bank 1. Numbered here, 7 through 12, bank 2. Again, split up into 2 sets of 3. Now, as you can see, the OEM exhaust system runs down into the muffler and then out of the system via these valves here. And where most of the aftermarket tends to try to improve the system is either by removing these cats, but still leaving essentially a 2 into 1, a bank into a bank, and then they'll run a fancy X-pipe, something along those lines, and get a great sounding system. But if we were gonna do a system, I couldn't do what everyone else was gonna do. It had to be bigger, it had to be crazier, it had to be better. And that led to a lot of thoughts. Things like 180-degree headers, which would be really cool to do, but with the amount of metal, materials, the fabrication that would go into it, I don't know if it would ever really be worth the cost with the power and the sound that you'd eventually get out of it to most people. Maybe as a work of art, something along those lines, you might find the right buyer for it. But for what we're trying to achieve, which is a power increase and a completely different, unique sound, we had a more straightforward solution that was going to be tried by us, but we had to get the proper parts removed. And what that solution was is using a 4-into-1 collector. Now, the stock tubing from each of the manifolds running down runs at 2 1/4 out, and that is universal amongst all of the systems. The manifold is only as big as 2 1/4 coming out before it enters the catalytic converter or the factory, or excuse me, aftermarket pipes that are supplied by most systems. Which means if we had a 4-into-1 collector that could hold the primaries of 2 1/4, we could essentially run one collector. Now you might be thinking, okay, you got one collector, you're merging that back in, but you're kind of squishing all of that volume of air into one area. Now, while that's where we're going with a 3.5-inch outlet for the collector, and you might say right away, isn't that a little too small? You got to remember, when dealing with exhaust, it's not just the size of the piping, but it's also the length of the piping. So if we could keep this relatively short, we're not going to run into the same restriction issues that we would if we were closing down the diameter of the piping for the bends that we were making in the system, meaning we probably won't suffer any horsepower losses and it would still be free flowing. So the idea here would be to get primaries of 2 1/4 with an outlet. Now this is just a collector we had lying around, but with an outlet of 3.5 to come out to the factory system, or not the factory system, where the factory system does come out at. I've got a factory system here, and I think you'll notice a few things that we probably touched on in the last video, but these guys here, hair under 3 inches. Now these are your 2 valves that open directly out when the system's activated, allowing more or less a straight dump with an H-pipe out of the system to give you more of the Lamborghini sound. But what's really interesting is the system, when it's closed, all of that V12 is going back through 2 1/4. That whole system is coming out of one single exit. That gives us a little room to play. So what I came up with is using that 4-into-1 collector, which we could fit back there. We have the room, but here's the issue. If I do a 2-into-1 collector, we need to look at the firing order, because in order to maximize its ability to scavenge and to have this thing have the most amount of improvement, we need to create a spinning vortices inside of the collector to help scavenge the air, so that way the pulses from the cylinders firing aren't nailing into each other, causing reverb, causing a insufficient flow. Ideally, if that air is spinning down in there, that's going to give us a little bit better flow, but it's not as easy as I thought. And here's why. We got to go back to the firing order. The firing order on the V12 Aventador, 112, 4, 9, 2, 11, 6, 7, 3, 10, 5, 8. Now these are when the cylinders fire after each other in that order. Cylinder 1 being in green. And for you guys, I marked what order those cylinders are firing. So if you notice here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What do we see as we're jumping around? 1, 2, 3, 4, which I have labeled. 1, 2, 3, 4. It repeats. 1, 2, 3, 4. It keeps repeating. So if I can time those pulses in order to keep repeating in that circle, we can take more advantage of the scavenging. But here's the difficulty. Where the pipes come out, and as you see here, we've got 1 and we've got 2. No problem. They can go 1 lines up with this side, 2 lines up with this side. So if we are going to go to 3 now, you see that this now has to come over here. And 3 has to come over here. Now, it might seem like, is there a lot of room? You could just move them in front and back. Well, either 3 has to come all the way around and over, and 4 has to come out and over. But at some point, there's no getting around the fact that those pipes have to cross. And that cross in itself creates a lot of wasted space. So that's going to be the biggest difficulty in trying to figure out how we get a system that spins and takes advantage of the scavenging of the exhaust gases. I'm not quite sure how we're going to do it. Trying to keep this equal length would be nice, but again, we're going to have to see. And we're not done there. We still have more stuff to put in that area. This is a valve to control the exhaust, similar to the OE exhausts, except we're going to do one 3.5 inch in the middle and attempt to run the 2 smaller ones on the outside. But one more thing. Catalytic converters. Got to have catalytic converters, so that way when the system's closed, we're still friendly to the environment. So this system should have it all. It's a little complicated, but how are we really changing the sound of this car other than just running a bunch of pipes together? And that's FMU's last little secret, the megaphone. Now, what a megaphone does, it's a function of pressure and it's a function of resonance. Most of the time, megaphones are used to direct the sound waves and direct the pressure that the sound waves are interacting with into a more focused manner, so that way it's not just spilling straight out. That way you can have a louder and longer throwing sound wave, more directional. But in an exhaust system, it's a little bit different because we have to cut it back down to reach the rest of the system. But over the years, man, since 2009, I'd say we've done probably 3 custom exhausts a month for 15 years. And that's got to be, at this point, 700 something exhausts. And I'm not even talking about the systems that we've done as production. I'm talking about custom exhausts on different cars. We've been using megaphones to change the sound of the vehicles. And what I found, and I'm sure, again, I'm not a scientist. I don't have any credits for knowing this stuff, knowing the science behind it, the engineering that goes behind it. What I do know is that with that many exhausts that we've built, putting a megaphone in there, as long as we can reach within the constraints of the vehicle, and then tapering it back down, tends to give us a little bit higher of a pitch on these more exotic sounding cars. Where do we have space for that? That's why the cats are down here. We're going to be utilizing the space along the manifolds in the place that the original catalytic converters were in order to try to get this thing a little bit more V12 sounding. That's a lot to put in the back of this car. And if I had gone over this before, looking at the car, I don't know if we would have been able to do it. But now that we have it apart and we've kind of laid some things out, it's going to be tight, but I think it's possible. And I think we're going to try to get at it. So already we're running into difficulties trying to follow the plan that we drew out on paper of the exhaust gas spinning in the collector. Now, you might be familiar with the principle of pouring fluid into a funnel. Now, if you just dump the fluid into a funnel, depending on which way you put it, it'll oftentimes back up. But if you get it along the side and induce a spin on it, the fluid tends to flow a little quicker with the spin. And that's kind of the principle here that we're trying to induce by having each bank firing induce the pulse down the collector to maximize the scavenging of the exhaust system. Now, there's a lot of factors involved: heat, pressure, the firing order. All these things are important, but the one factor that we really can't control are the space constraints of the vehicle. So with that said, we can have the best exhaust system in the world designed on paper, but given a fixed amount of space, the constraints of the vehicle, what you've got to fit into this area, that might not end up happening. And we're really scratching our heads on how to get this done, and I'll kind of show you why. So here I've got labeled the firing order, which I went over on the diagram. Bank 1, this side. Bank 1's going to be down here, the further up cylinders. Cylinders 1 through 3. Bank 2. Firing on that side, and we're going off of the firing order. As you can see, again, from the diagram, when we went over the firing order, we're trying to maximize these 4 banks in order to increase the most scavenging possible. We're going to try to get this equal length, but again, a lot of people get hung up on equal length, and while equal length is great on paper, having your bends exactly the same distance from the pipe center line, ideal, very ideal. The problem, though, that you get into is that equal length is affected also by the bends in the pipe, the radius, the turns. All of that has an effect on flow. A really curvy bent tube is going to have much lower flow than a straight section of the same length, even though they're equal length. So while your system might have equal length headers, if one bank is really twisted up and bent, you're not going to have exactly the same flow. So a lot of times equal length is kind of moot when you're trying to stick it into a car. So ideally, you're just trying to make sure that you have the conditions as ideal as possible within the constraints of the vehicle. And again, that's where we're running into issues. 1, 2, 3, 4. As you'll see here, 1 and 2, getting those to fire, bam, bam, this side. But then we get into an issue with 3 and 4. 3 being on this side over here, and 4 being over this side. So, that being said, at some point the pipes have to cross each other. And where that cross fits in isn't really the difficult part, because we can just fab up something and make them cross over. But it's got to look good too. This is a Lamborghini Aventador. This is a high dollar, high horsepower performance machine. And even though this is in the back underneath a bunch of panels behind a bumper, people still want to know it looks like it belongs in a car that cost $400,000 at the time of its production. So symmetry is something we're shooting for. Things that look cohesive. And that's where Cody comes in here. Cody's helping us try to figure this out. Well, I might draw something up on paper that sounds good. Cody's the one who has to kind of put this thing together and make it come to life. And I could tell I'm already liking the design, but where we go from here, I think is going to be the challenging part. Would you agree with that?
100%. Yeah, trying to get everything to fit in there is pretty difficult.
Yeah, and he's got some ideas of how we can run these pipes. We've already kind of shot down a few ideas, but we're really limited on space where we can run these pipes while at the same time making them look good. I'm sure you could probably just get it done, but that's not really the way you operate. I know you're really trying to make this thing look nice.
Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of people can just slap anything together, but making this thing look top notch is the difficult part for sure.
Yeah, I think we've got a few more iterations to try. I know we'll get it done, but that being said, if we really want to try to bring the sound out like nobody else has, The firing order is going to be key here, getting this 4-into-1 collector and just giving up and having two of the banks fire one after each other because they're on the same side is what everybody else does. And we're not making something that everybody else has. We're making something that hasn't been made before. And that's going to require us to deal with problems that haven't been ran into before. So let's see what Cody can come up with. All right, so Donnie's telling me that he wants me to come check out the final layout for the exhaust that we built on the Aventador. So let's go see what we got. Now, we've been watching this thing come together. We've been making a lot of jokes about it being a McDonald's exhaust, the Heart Valentine's Day edition. It's a pretty unique setup. So let's take a look here. I told you guys it was going to be complicated getting these pipes to cross over. We really didn't have a ton of room because two of the banks, in order to be able to fire one after each other, had to cross sides. And while getting the pipes across can be done, getting it to look fairly symmetrical is the difficult part. And then keeping in mind various lengths of pipe as well. So this setup is pretty wild looking. Cody, how did you figure out how to get these pipes down here? What'd you end up having to do?
Well, it was basically just kind of figuring every part out one step at a time. And I had to make sure I had enough room towards the bottom to actually have two tubes. Because if it's closer up to the top, you can't fit two tubes in there. So I had to go down and meet in a good spot where there's plenty of room between the engine and the other part of the exhaust. So
yeah, it looks like you used every ounce of this space, and just because everything's in place doesn't mean it's going to stay in place. I know from doing this over the years, you've still got some challenges about keeping this thing together. Do you want to tell everyone a little bit about that? Like what you're going to run into getting this thing welded up?
yeah, so most of the time when you're welding all these tubes together, you got to worry about push and pull and warpage and everything crazy like that. So with the amount of welds that are going into this exhaust system, you gotta be really careful about where it's gonna pull, how it's gonna pull. So there's good technique behind how to weld it properly so it doesn't pull or pulls in the right direction that you want it to. So
now, taking into the account the expansion of the stainless steel, we've placed in some bellows to allow a little bit of flex and movement that naturally occurs in the stainless steel. Will also help with positioning, getting the thing mounted up as well. And we're going to need it with all these pipes moving every which way. So, like I said, this is wild. Because of how things are firing, we should be able to hear that in the exhaust. Not to mention, Aventadors are known for shooting flames on exhausts. I think this spin is going to produce something pretty wild when all's said and done. And you already know this, but we're not even done yet. We still got the switch section to fit in here, but I think we got just enough room to do that still. But this is the crux. This is what's going to sound. All of the parts for us trying to get the most unique sound out of an Aventador are in place. They just need to be welded up. And here it is, a seemingly complicated system, but with a purpose. A system that does it all. A system that utilizes exhaust scavenging, exhaust megaphones to increase pitch in a V12, valves for straight open performance, catalytic converters, and it looks pretty good too. I'm proud of the work that went into this Aventador. By sticking to our principles of uniqueness, craftsmanship, and incorporating high-performance design elements, we've made something that'll do it all. But we're not done yet. we still have to figure out how to get the system to not only work in conjunction with the factory control, but also offer an additional level of control. Silence to violence. We also need to get this thing back on the dyno and finish the tune to really maximize the gains the exhaust will produce. And I know you guys want to see this thing in action, as well as get some reaction from the owner and maybe a YouTube influencer. You're not going to want to miss this. But that's all for this video. Make sure you're liking and subscribing, and tell us what you think about the power gain will be on our Heartbreaker dyno. Until next time.